There are people who give their lives to something without ever asking the world to notice. They do not need the spotlight, they do not need the validation. They simply show up day after day and pour everything they have into the work because the work is the point. Because for them, the making of something that matters to other people is its own complete and sufficient reward. Michael Feldman lived that way. For nearly 3 decades, he built something that millions of people genuinely loved, a radio program that became, for a quiet but devoted audience, as reliable and as welcome as a familiar face at the door. He was not famous in the way that culture usually manufactures fame. His name did not trend. His image did not sell products. But his voice, and more than his voice, the specific quality of warmth and wit and human intelligence that came through it, became part of the Saturday morning landscape of American life in a way that very few creative people ever achieve. He made something that people needed without knowing they needed it, and he made it with a level of consistent care that most creative projects never sustain. And then, at 57, the ground shifted. Not gradually, not with the kind of slow, manageable erosion that gives a person time to adjust and prepare. It shifted the way ground shifts when it is done without announcement, quickly, completely, and in ways that left the people around him uncertain how to respond to what they were witnessing. What followed was not a simple story of misfortune. It was something more layered and more human than that. It was the story of what happens when the life a person has spent decades carefully constructing, the work, the identity. The daily architecture of purpose begins to come apart at multiple points simultaneously. And it was the story of what remains in a person when that happens, what survives, what astonishingly does not break. That is the story worth telling. To feel the real weight of what eventually happened to Michael Feldman, you have to begin where the story actually begins, not at the crisis, but at the years before it. At the life that was still whole, at the work that was still doing exactly what it was made to do. What You Know was a public radio program unlike almost anything else in its medium. It ran on Saturday mornings, broadcast out of Madison, Wisconsin, and it reached, at its height, millions of listeners across the country. The format was simple in the way that only deeply skilled things can afford to be simple. Part quiz show, part conversation. Part improvised comedy that nobody could have scripted, because it was genuinely happening in real time. Feldman would take calls from listeners, ask questions nobody could answer, say things that made people laugh out loud in their cars and their kitchens, and somehow make the whole rambling, cheerful enterprise feel like spending an hour with someone you had always known and always liked. That feeling was not an accident. It was the product of real craft and genuine character. Feldman had grown up in Milwaukee, and the city had given him something that showed in everything he created, a sensibility that was unpretentious without being simple. That was grounded without being dull. His humor never punched down, his wit was sharp without being cruel. He had the particular gift of making an audience feel seen at exactly the moment they were laughing, and that combination, warmth and humor working together without canceling each other out, is rarer than most people understand. He had built the show from nothing, not inherited it, not been handed it, not been assigned it by an institution that had already determined what it should be. He had imagined it, developed it, fought for it through the years of uncertain funding and institutional skepticism that every independent creative project navigates before it finds its footing. And then he had protected it, its tone, its character, its particular refusal to be anything other than exactly what it was through the long decades of its life. The people who worked alongside him during those years describe an environment that felt like the show itself, genuine rather than performed, collaborative in the actual sense, not the corporate one. According to various accounts, Feldman led not by authority but by the sheer quality of his attention and preparation, by showing up fully every time and making it impossible not to match that. Off-air, his life in Madison had the same quality. He was embedded in the community in the way that people who genuinely love where they live become embedded, not as a prominent local figure performing civic attachment, but as a neighbor. A colleague, a person who showed up at the ordinary crossings of a shared life, and whose presence at those crossings made them slightly better. He was known by the people who knew him as himself, not as a broadcaster, not as a public personality, but as Michael. Someone whose humor was the same at a dinner table as it was behind a microphone. Someone who paid attention to people in the specific, unreplicable way that makes a person feel genuinely held in someone else's regard. At 57, he was exactly where he had worked to be. The show was still running, the audience was still there. The life he had built in Madison was full and rooted and real. From any outside perspective, this was a man who had figured out something that most people never quite manage: how to spend your working life doing something you love, somewhere you love, with people you love. How to build a life whose external shape matches the internal one. It was real. Every bit of it was real. And it was, with no visible warning, about to be tested in ways that no amount of careful building could have prepared him for. A life that has been constructed carefully over many years develops a kind of invisible solidity. The work behind it recedes. What remains visible is only the result: the career, the relationships, the rhythms of daily existence that make a person look from the outside like someone who has arrived somewhere stable and is simply living there comfortably. What disappears from view is the constant, quiet effort that keeps a life like that intact, the choices made consistently over years, the discipline of showing up when showing up is not easy, the willingness to care about the small things when small things are all that is available to care about. For Michael Feldman, all of that invisible effort was real. The stability was genuinely earned, but it was also in the end no protection against what was coming. Wadya No had not simply appeared in the world. It had been willed into existence, and then sustained by a particular combination of creative vision and the kind of practical stubbornness that distinguishes the people who actually finish things from the people who only imagine them. Feldman had believed in the show during the years when belief was the only available resource. He had shaped it and defended it, and kept it recognizably itself through every pressure that the public broadcasting ecosystem generates: pressures of funding cycles and institutional priorities, and the slow, grinding tendency of organizations to want things simpler and safer, and easier to categorize than what he was making. The result was something that lasted because it deserved to last. Not because it was loud or controversial or algorithmically optimized for sharing, but because it was genuinely good in the specific way that good things earn loyalty: by being consistently, reliably themselves. The audience knew what they were coming for. They knew they were going to get Michael Feldman at a microphone, fully present, being exactly who he was. And they came back for it, week after week, year after year, in the way that people return to something when it has given them something real. The people he worked with understood the privilege of that environment. The humor was not performed for effect. It was the natural byproduct of people who actually found each other funny, working together on something they actually believed in. According to various accounts, Feldman's leadership was never about authority or hierarchy. It was about example. About what it looked like to care about a thing enough to give it your complete attention, and about how that quality of care quietly raises the standard for everyone working alongside you. In Madison, outside the studio, the same man existed. Not a version of himself adjusted for public consumption, but the actual person, present in the neighborhood, present in the friendships, present at the ordinary gatherings of a life that had deep roots in a specific place, and among specific people who had known him long enough to know him well. He was 57, he had everything he had worked for. He was, in the most honest sense of the phrase, living the life he had chosen, but something was shifting in the world around that life. Something quiet and institutional at first, operating at the level of industry economics and programming strategy, the kind of forces that seem abstract until they become personal, and then suddenly feel like nothing but. The signals that something was changing did not arrive with any drama. They rarely do when the disruption is cultural and institutional rather than sudden and personal. They arrive as questions in meetings, as shifts in the language used to describe something that had previously been described differently, as the particular unease of sensing that a relationship you thought was built on solid ground has begun to be renegotiated in terms you did not agree to. Public radio, the world that had sustained Wadya No across nearly 3 decades, was in genuine transition during this period. The economic model that had supported independent, personality-driven programming was under pressure from multiple directions at once. Listener habits were changing, funding structures were evolving. The institutional priorities of public broadcasting were shifting towards something that did not, by its nature, have much room for a long-running Saturday quiz show whose primary value was the irreplaceable specific quality of the person hosting it. These were not forces aimed at Michael Feldman. They were the broad environmental pressures of an industry navigating an era that was changing faster than most institutions could comfortably absorb. But broad forces do not stay broad, they land somewhere on someone. And for a person whose professional identity was as genuinely and completely intertwined with a single creative project as Feldman's was, someone who had not kept a careful distance from the work, who had given himself to it without reservation, the shifting ground beneath the industry was not an abstraction. It was personal, quietly and increasingly, it was deeply personal. According to reports, conversations about the future of the show became more complicated during this period. Questions were being asked that had not previously been asked or had not needed to be asked. About sustainability. About whether the program still fit the direction the institution was moving toward. These are the kinds of conversations that, for the person at the center of them, feel like much more than strategic planning. They feel like being told that something you built with your hands and your years is being measured against criteria that have nothing to do with whether it is any good. Feldman continued. He kept showing up. He brought the same fullness of attention and humor and genuine care for the audience that the show had always represented, because that is what people do when they love what they do. They keep doing it even when the conditions for doing it have become uncertain, even when the institutional enthusiasm has cooled, even when the future of the thing they love has become genuinely unclear. But the ground had shifted. Something had changed in the landscape that surrounded the life he had built. And the shift was not finished, not even close. There is a kind of loss that does not arrive as a single moment, it builds. It accumulates through a series of smaller moments, each of which is individually manageable and collectively devastating, decisions that seem one by one like minor adjustments. Until you step back and realize that the thing you valued has been quietly negotiated out of existence, while you were trying to manage each individual conversation. That is how Wadya No ended. According to reports, the show that Michael Feldman had created and devoted nearly 30 years of his life to did not conclude with a dramatic cancellation. It ended in the way that institutions end things when they have decided, perhaps correctly in their own terms, that a chapter is over through the slow withdrawal of the support that had made it possible, through the evolution of priorities in directions that no longer included what the show had always been. It was the kind of ending that is in some ways harder to grieve than a sudden one, because it offers no single clear moment of loss, just the gradual recognition that something is already mostly gone. For any broadcaster, losing a long-running program is significant. For Michael Feldman, it was something that language does not quite reach. The show was not just what he did. It was the structure around which a life had been organized. It was the weekly rhythm of preparation and broadcast and audience connection. It was the community of collaborators who had become, over years of shared work, something much closer than colleagues. It was the ongoing relationship with a listenership that had been loyal not to a brand or a format, but to him, to the specific quality of his presence, his humor, his genuine regard for the people on the other end of the radio. All of that was not a job, it was a world. And when it ended, what was left was not a professional transition requiring adaptation. It was something more like what happens when a person is suddenly without the structure that had given their days their meaning, and their identity its primary shape. According to those close to him, Feldman navigated that loss with the same quality of outward steadiness that had always characterized him. He was not someone who performed struggle for sympathy. Not someone who needed the people around him to confirm how hard things were. But the people who loved him understood that what he was carrying was genuinely heavy, that the end of the show was not something he could simply reframe and move past on any ordinary timeline. And then, before the shape of whatever came next had even begun to form, something arrived that made the loss of the show feel, in retrospect, like the first in a series of tests rather than the test itself. There are things that happen in a life that do not simply change its circumstances, they restructure it. They reach past the external details, the career, the plans, the daily routines, and rearrange something more fundamental, the way a person understands their own future. The quiet assumptions about what comes next that most of us carry without examining until they are suddenly, irrevocably no longer reliable. For Michael Feldman, what arrived next was that kind of thing. According to reports, the period following the end of the show brought serious health challenges, challenges that arrived in the way the worst ones tend to. Without adequate preparation time, and without the consideration of whether the person facing them had any remaining capacity to absorb them. He was already navigating the grief of professional loss. already trying to locate himself in the unfamiliar landscape of a life whose primary structure had been removed. And into that already depleted space, something arrived that demanded everything. The specific nature of what he faced has been described by people who know him and love him with the particular care that people use when they are discussing something real and serious about someone. They are protective of. What those descriptions convey, even in their careful restraint, is that the health challenges he encountered were not minor. Not the manageable kind that a person absorbs into a normal life and moves through without being fundamentally changed. They were the kind that require your full and undivided attention. That renegotiate without asking permission the terms on which you were planning to live the next chapter of your life. At 57, an age that carries its own particular weight. That sits at the intersection of accumulated experience and new vulnerabilities. Feldman found himself managing the convergence of these two enormous things simultaneously. That convergence matters. It is worth really sitting with because it is easy to understand intellectually and very hard to fully absorb emotionally. When professional loss and serious physical challenge arrive at the same time, they do not simply coexist. They compound each other in ways that are genuinely cruel. The emotional reserves that health challenges demand are the same reserves that grief depletes. They do not take turns. They do not wait for each other. They simply arrive together and ask for everything you have. What the people close to him describe about this period is something that, in its own quiet way, is remarkable. Not because of the difficulty speaks for itself, but because of what did not change in him while he was carrying it. The humor was still there. Not performed, not deployed as a coping mechanism for the benefit of the people around him, but genuinely present in the way it had always been present, as simply part of who he was. The warmth was still there, the specific attentiveness to other people that had always made his presence in a room feel like a gift rather than an expectation. He did not share the full picture publicly. He did not perform his struggle or curate his suffering for an audience. And that restraint, that quiet dignity in the face of something that would have justified any amount of public expression, said as much about the kind of person he had always been as anything he had ever done on air. Where Michael Feldman stands now, on the other side of everything this period brought, is not a place with a clean narrative shape. Some stories resolve into something that retroactively makes sense of the difficulty, a new beginning that explains why the ending was necessary. A fresh chapter that justifies the losses of the previous one. His story does not have that shape yet, it may never have it, and that ambiguity is part of what makes it so honest. He is still here, that is not a small statement. The period he navigated was genuinely hard enough, and hard enough on multiple fronts simultaneously, that his continued presence in the world, his continued capacity to be warm, to be funny, to be fully and recognizably himself, is not something to take for granted. It is something that reflects the actual substance of the person, not resilience as an abstract concept, but the concrete, lived reality of someone whose character was built deeply enough that difficulty could not reach the foundation of it. The people who know him speak about him now with the particular kind of tenderness that appears in accounts of someone who has been through something real and come out of it still intact. Changed, yes, nobody navigates what he navigated without being changed by it, but not diminished, not reduced. Still the person they recognized, still the person whose presence makes rooms better, whose attention makes people feel held, whose humor arrives without agenda and lands without cruelty. According to those close to him, the relationships that mattered most proved, under the pressure of this period, to be exactly what they had appeared to be. The friendships that had been built over years and decades did not shift when the professional structures fell away. The familial bonds that had always been the deeper ground of his life remained the deeper ground. Those connections, the ones built on the actual person rather than on the career or the public presence, turned out to be the most durable thing in the architecture of a life. More durable than the work, more durable than the recognition, more durable than everything that circumstance can remove. What comes next for Michael Feldman does not have a defined shape. The career chapter that defined his public life has closed. The health challenges he navigated have left marks that only he can fully account for. The future does not have the clarity it once had. And all of that is genuinely uncertain in a way that deserves acknowledgement rather than optimistic reframing. But the real tragedy, the one that would be worth grieving, would be if the difficulty became the whole story. If the hard years became the frame through which everything else was seen. If the extraordinary, sustained, decades-long gift of what he created for the people who listened every Saturday morning was reduced to a footnote in a story about what went wrong, that would be the real loss, not the loss of the show or the health challenges or the uncertainty of what comes next, but the loss of the recognition that something extraordinary was made here by someone who genuinely loved making it, and that it mattered in all the ways that things quietly and durably matter. That loss has not happened, not yet, and it does not have to. What stays with you after spending real time with the arc of this story is not the difficulty. The difficulty was real and it deserves honest acknowledgement, but it is not the center of gravity. It never was. What stays with you is the work. Almost 30 years of a radio program that asked almost nothing of its audience except an hour of their Saturday morning, and the willingness to be genuinely surprised and genuinely entertained. That delivered week after week, something that felt easy precisely because of the enormous care that went into it. That made millions of people's ordinary weekend mornings a little richer and a little warmer in ways those people probably never stopped to analyze. Because you do not analyze the things that have become part of the furniture of your life. You simply reach for them and they are there, and you feel slightly better for it, and you never quite understand how much you will miss them until the Saturday morning arrives when they are gone. Michael Feldman gave people that. Across decades, with a consistency and a quality of genuine investment that very few creative people sustain over that length of time. He gave it without demanding that people notice the difficulty of the giving. He gave it because giving it was what he loved. Because the audience on the other end of the radio was real to him, and he was real to them. And that mutual reality was the thing the show was actually made of underneath all the jokes and the quiz questions, and the impeccable timing. In a culture that measures worth by volume, by visibility, by metrics, by the loudness of reception, it is easy to undervalue the kind of contribution that works quietly and accumulates slowly. That finds people in their ordinary moments rather than their exceptional ones. That does not announce its importance, but simply becomes, over time, part of the texture of a life. But quiet contributions are not lesser contributions. They are often, when you look at them honestly and at the right distance, the ones that leave the deepest marks. The ones that shaped how people felt on Saturday mornings for 20 years. The ones that made strangers feel less alone in their cars on the highway. The ones that gave people something warm to wake up to, reliably, in a world that does not offer that kind of reliability very often. At 57, Michael Feldman encountered a convergence of losses that would have unmade many people. The work that had given his life its shape gone. The physical challenges that arrived while he was still adjusting to that loss, demanding more than what remained. Both of those things at once, without the kindness of adequate spacing between them. That he navigated all of it, imperfectly, humanly, without putting on a performance of managing it well. With his warmth and his humor and his fundamental decency toward the people around him still intact, says something that goes beyond the ordinary language of strength or resilience. It says something about what was built in him long before any of this arrived to test it. About the kind of person who exists beneath the radio host and the public figure and the professional identity. About the human being who was always, in the end, the actual source of everything the work contained. There are people who make the world louder, and there are people who make it warmer. Michael Feldman was always in the second group. He showed up quietly and consistently for nearly 30 years, and he offered something genuine to anyone willing to listen. That deserves to be held carefully. That deserves to be remembered with the fullness it earned, not as a tragedy, as a life, a real, full, extraordinary human life. If this story reached something in you, if it made you think about the creators who made your ordinary mornings better without ever asking you to notice, about the voices that became part of the furniture of your life before you understood how much they mattered, share that in the comments. The people whose work quietly shaped us deserve to be remembered out loud. If you think stories like this one deserve to be told and to find the audiences they belong to, consider subscribing. We will keep telling them carefully, honestly, with the attention they deserve, because the people behind the work you loved were real, and real people deserve to be seen.